Today, in this video, we shall see what is a food chain and what is a food web. As you know, we have studied the feeding relationship between organisms. So, the feeding relationship between organisms in an ecosystem can be called as the food chain or food web prevalent in that ecosystem. So here we will study about food chains and food webs. So almost all organisms get their energy from sun. So you know that point, right? So we will move on to food chain. So food chain is a series of organisms that depend on each other as sources of food. So the diagram given here is an example of food chain. So this is a food chain where the maize is being consumed by a locust, the locust consumed by the lizard, and the lizard is consumed by a snake. So this is an example of a food chain. And these are some other examples of food chains in an ecosystem. Just pause the video and analyze these diagrams and understand the meaning of food chain. So we can ultimately define food chain as it shows the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. So energy is transferred between the organisms when one organism eats another. So a food chain is a simple linear series of steps, while a food web is more complex. So these are the types of food chains. So food chains are classified mainly into two: grazing food chain and Detritus or Saprophytic food chain. So grazing food chain is further divided into two. First we will see the main division of food chain. So the food chain is being divided mainly into grazing food chain and Detritus food chain. The first one given here is the grazing food chain, where the initial organism is live, and in case of Detritus food chain, the initial organism is dead. So a grazing food chain is one where the initial organism is living. For example, see these examples: grass to grasshoppers, then frogs, hawks, honeysuckle, aphids, ladybirds, thrushes, seaweed, wrinkles, crabs, herring gulls, phytoplankton, zooplankton, copod herring. These are the examples of grazing food chains where all the initial organisms are living. So the grazing food chain is further divided into predatory food chain and parasitic food chain. So in case of predatory food chain, as you know that there will be a prey-predator relationship, the one who hunts and one who is being eaten. Now we will see the second classification of the grazing food chain. That is the parasitic food chain. In here you know that the producers are being eaten by the herbivores, and the herbivores have parasites on the herbivores like lices and bugs, and these lices and bugs can be eaten within by bacteria, fungi, etc. So this comes from producers to herbivores to herbivore parasites to hyperparasites. So this is a parasitic food chain. So next one we will see is the second one, the main classification, that is the Detritus or Saprophytic food chain. So as you have studied that the grazing food chain, the initial organism is alive, but in case of the Detritus or Saprophytic food chain, the organism which begins the food chain is dead organic matter or animal waste. So here you can see dead leaves will be eaten by the woodlouse, and the woodlouse will be in turn eaten by the blackbird. So this is a detritus food chain. So here you can see both type of the food chains, that is the grazing food chain as well as the detritus or saprophytic food chain. So please pause this video right now and just go through these different types of food chains, how they are interlinked. So just go and you can see how these two food chains are interlinked. Now we will move on to vast aspect of the ecosystem. So an ecosystem consists of a group of organisms, right? So would you consider that only food chains are possible, like there's only linear feeding interaction between organisms? No, it is not like that. There are intrinsic web-like series of interaction or feeding interaction between organisms in an ecosystem. So that is called a food web. So a food web shows the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. So the energy is transferred between organisms when one organism eats another, and the food web is more complicated and intrinsic than a food chain. So a multitude of food chains group together and form food web. So a food web is when you consider the entire organisms present in an ecosystem. So here is an example of a food web in a marine ecosystem. As you can see, the diatoms and planktons are eaten by many organisms. Then these organisms are in turn eaten by other organisms. So these organisms interact and interrelate with each other, and the feeding habitat is a series of interlinked or network of relationship between these organisms. So there is another example of a food web in a terrestrial ecosystem, and this is a detritus food web, and here it shows how the energy is transferred from the initial dead matter to the optimal or the last final organisms. So these are intricate or network of series of food chains. So these levels, different levels in the food chain or food web is known as trophic levels. We have studied the different trophic levels present in an ecosystem. So there are 4 trophic levels: producers and primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. So these are the 4 levels of or 4 trophic levels present in a food web or a food chain. So the first one is producers, then the herbivores, then carnivores, then top predators. So let me ask you a question. So we know we humans eat a variety of organisms, right? So we have learned about what are food chains and food web, and what are the different trophic levels in the food chain and food web. So let me ask you a question. How human fit into this? What is the position of human in the food chain or food web in an ecosystem? Kindly answer it